Hello, and welcome to this webinar recording, Understanding Neurodivergence and Sexual Violence, Building Awareness, Compassion, and Safer Responses. My name is Ashley Locke. I am the Youth Education Coordinator here at the Dragonfly Center, and I will be facilitating this webinar for you today. This webinar is meant for educators, advocates, and support professionals who work with neurodivergent people and want to better support them as survivors of sexual violence. Our goal today is to increase awareness of how neurodivergent people may be uniquely impacted by sexual violence and to learn how to create safer, affirming responses to any disclosures of sexual violence. Neurodivergence is not a one-size-fits-all, and every person's brain and experiences are unique. This session includes some common patterns, some trends and possibilities, but not universal truths. Throughout this webinar, you'll notice a mix of person-centered language, such as a person with autism, as well as identity-centered language, for example, an autistic person. And this is intentional. This is a reflection of the voices and preferences of the neurodivergent survivors who are quoted or represented throughout this webinar. Some of those individuals whose stories or perspectives are shared prefer that person first language, emphasizing their identity beyond a diagnosis, while others prefer their identity first language, seeing their autism or their ADHD or other neurotype as a core part of who they are and not as something separate. So rather than standardizing or correcting those differences, we've chosen to honor each person's unique language choices as part of affirming their experience, voice, and agency. I do want to preface before we begin that this webinar does include some strong language and descriptions related to sexual violence that some viewers may find triggering or distressing. And rather than censoring some of that language, we recognize how important it is to reflect the words and experiences of those neurodivergent survivors authentically. So the language that is used comes directly from those survivor testimonies and research. With that said, please take care of yourself as you watch. You're encouraged to pause, step away, take breaks, or seek support whenever you need to. And here is our agenda. So we're going to go over the foundations of neurodiversity first, and then we'll go into sexual violence and neurodivergent survivors. Then we'll go into recognizing and responding to neurodivergent survivors, and we'll finish off with accountability, healing, and advocacy. We need to make sure that we're all familiar with the terms that we will use, and the abbreviations, and the umbrella terms that we'll use throughout the webinar. So first we have neurodivergent, which is sometimes abbreviated to ND, which you'll see throughout this webinar. And this is a person whose brain works differently. It could be that they have autism or ADHD or dyslexia. Then we have neurotypical, which we will abbreviate as NT. This is a person whose brain functions in socially expected ways. Neurodiverse means a group that includes many different brain types, neurodivergent and neurotypical. And then we have sexual violence. This is any unwanted sexual behavior, act, or activity, or any attempt to coerce or force someone into sexual activity without their consent. And so the terms neurodivergent and sexual violence are both what are called umbrella terms, which just means that it is one term that encompasses a wide range of experiences, identities, and realities. Neurodivergent includes various neurotypes like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, while sexual violence covers acts such as sexual harassment, sexual assault, and sexual exploitation. So before we explore how sexual violence impacts neurodivergent people, It's important to understand that neurodivergent and neurotypical people often experience and interact with the world in very different ways. This is a foundational knowledge that we will build on throughout our webinar. A few key areas that we will discuss today are processing and perception, communication styles, emotional expression and regulation, as well as social and sensory boundaries. Now, keep in mind that there is no one size fits all profile or understanding. Neurodivergence exists on a spectrum, and it is possible for some areas of functioning to match neurotypical peers, but other areas express vast differences from their neurotypical peers. And these are not deficits. These are just different ways of experiencing and navigating the world. When we assume that everyone thinks, feels, or reacts like a neurotypical person, we risk misunderstanding or overlooking what a neurodivergent person is truly experiencing. So, recognizing these differences is the first step in offering support that is respectful, accessible, and affirming. So, let's start with processing and perception. This is about how people take in and make sense of the world around them. Different brains prioritize different information. So, starting with neurotypical individuals, they often process information in expected and linear ways. They follow a beginning, middle, and end pattern when listening, problem solving, or telling stories. And professionals may unconsciously expect this structure when supporting someone. So, we need to be aware and mindful of our expectations. Neurotypical folks can often filter out background noise or stimuli more easily. Sounds like buzzing lights or overlapping voices. Um, Even like scratchy fabrics are easier to ignore or tune out. And this helps them stay focused in busy, noisy, or bright environments. Neurotypical folks can interpret tone and body language and social nuance intuitively, naturally. They often pick up on things like sarcasm, facial expressions, and unspoken social cues without needing them explained. This intuitive social reading is often taken for granted. So let's compare that with neurodivergent individuals. They may process more slowly or more deeply. Some may need extra time to understand questions, especially during stress or overwhelm. Others may hyper focus on one thing and miss the broader context. Pauses or silence from a neurodivergent person does not mean that they are not engaged, they may just be processing deeply. They can experience different levels of sensitivity to lights, sounds, textures, smells. They may also seek extra input. Sensory environments that feel neutral to a neurotypical person can feel painful, exhausting, or distracting to a neurodivergent person. Conversely, they may seek out that sensory input, maybe rocking or humming or fidgeting, to help them feel more regulated. As an example, some neurodivergent folks may seek out hugs, deep hugs for that deep sensory pressure, not for that connection piece that neurotypical folks may seek out. They may miss or misinterpret social cues. Their tone of voice may not match their intent. They might take things literally, struggle with tone, or have a neutral expression even when they feel emotionally affected. Moving on to communication styles, everyone communicates, just not always in the same way. People express themselves in the ways that feel most natural or accessible to them, and that might not always match what we expect. Let's start with neurotypical individuals who tend to use and expect indirect or socially scripted communication. Many neurotypical people are socialized to read between the lines, and this can include subtle hints or social niceties, even avoiding directness to spare feelings. So instead of saying directly, I need space or I want to be alone, a neurotypical person might say, I'm just really busy right now, and expect others to pick up on the message. This style may feel polite or respectful, but can be confusing for someone who needs clarity or direct cues. Neurotypical individuals tend to understand and use sarcasm, idioms, and subtext easily. Phrases like break a leg or spill the tea or I'm dying of laughter. They may joke, well, that went great, after a bad meeting, relying on sarcasm to communicate disappointment. These layers of meaning aren't always obvious and can cause misunderstanding. Many neurotypical folks read pauses or eye contact as engagement cues. Things like head nodding or quick verbal cues like yeah, are often interpreted as active listening. In a conversation, someone who doesn't make eye contact or pause to say, a neurotypical speaker might assume the person isn't interested anymore, even if they're fully present and listening in their own way. When it comes to neurodivergent folks, they often prefer direct, literal, or precise language. Many value communication that's honest, concrete, and unambiguous. Instead of saying, maybe we can hang out sometime, a neurodivergent person might say, are you free Saturday at 3 p.m.? They may also ask clarifying questions like, what do you mean by that? Can you explain it another way? Not to be difficult, but to ensure mutual understanding. Many neurodivergent folks find that direct eye contact may be difficult or irrelevant. Silence may signal that they are processing, not that they are disengaged. So, as an example, a neurodivergent person might look at the floor during a conversation, but still remember every word that you said. Similarly, long pauses or silence often mean that someone is thinking carefully or feeling overwhelmed, not that they're ignoring you. Neurodivergent folks may also use scripting, echolalia, or alternative forms of expression. And for those unfamiliar, scripting is using memorized phrases, could be from media or past experiences or practice routines to communicate or navigate social situations. It's often intentional and functional. It's used to prepare for or manage interactions. It helps reduce anxiety or predict outcomes in conversations. As an example, someone might say, let's go on an adventure. Maybe this is from a movie they watched. So now every time they want to leave the house, they say, let's go on an adventure because it feels safe, it feels familiar. Echolalia is when a person repeats those words and phrases immediately or later on. As an example, someone might ask, do you want a snack? And that person responds, want a snack? Yes. Echolalia is not meaningless or just copying. For many neurodivergent people, it's a way to practice language, express emotions, communicate a need or a feeling using familiar phrases. It can help them regulate or soothe themselves. Other neurodivergent folks might use gestures, communication boards, or augmentative and alternative communication apps instead of or alongside their speech. Okay, and moving on to emotional expression and regulation. Emotional expression may look different or be hidden entirely. Starting with neurotypical folks, emotions are often expressed in ways considered socially appropriate. They're usually socialized to show feelings subtly, like a polite smile, controlled tone, or avoiding public emotional displays. So they might say things like, I'm fine, or smile when they're actually upset in order to maintain social comfort. With neurotypical folks, regulation is usually expected to be subtle or internalized. So they may be encouraged to self soothe privately or in a way that others don't notice, such as deep breathing or distracting themselves by looking at their cell phone, and visible emotional responses may be discouraged. Whereas with neurodivergent folks, emotions may be expressed more visibly through meltdowns or shutdowns or stimming. Neurodivergent people may rock, cry, pace, stim, or go silent. And this is not as a loss of control, but as a natural regulation method when overwhelmed. Neurodivergent folks may struggle to name emotions, but still feel them very intensely. Some neurodivergent folks experience what is called alexithymia, and this is a difficulty identifying or describing emotions, but that does not mean that they are not feeling deeply. For example, a neurodivergent person may say, I feel weird, instead of saying, I feel anxious or I feel scared, because they're just struggling to name that feeling, name that emotion. But they're still voicing that they need support. Neurodivergent folks may use external tools or movements to regulate. So their self-regulation might include sensory aids, movement, or vocalizing, and these strategies help them to restore calm and focus. So as an example, they may use a fidget or a weighted blanket or a weighted item, or they might want to pace during stressful situations, which can help many neurodivergent people stay grounded. And many neurodivergent folks may mask emotional expression in order to fit in, and this often comes at a personal cost. So, to avoid judgment or exclusion, neurodivergent people may hide or suppress their natural responses by not stimming, by faking calm, or using memorized scripts. And this masking can be exhausting, and it often disconnects them from their needs. So, a neurodivergent person might appear calm in a group setting, but later they're going to crash with exhaustion because of the effort it took to hold it together. And we are going to be talking about masking a little bit more throughout this webinar as well. Last, we're going to cover social and sensory boundaries. Everyone has boundaries, but how we express them and what we need can vary widely. So when we see neurotypical folks, we see that they often follow unwritten rules about space, touch, small talk, etc. And they tend to learn and follow social norms intuitively, like how far apart to stand, or when it's okay to hug, or how long to maintain eye contact for. So they may greet someone with a handshake or a hug, and it might feel automatic or expected in many social or professional settings for neurotypical people. And they also may assume that these normal preferences apply to everyone. So, without realizing it, neurotypical folks may expect others to enjoy things like group settings, tolerate background noise, or want that social chit chat and small talk, because those are considered normal. And then when we compare that to neurodivergent folks, they may have intense needs for space and quiet and predictability. Neurodivergent folks might find certain environments to be overstimulating or even distressing. Things like crowds, noise, or sudden changes in their routine can be overwhelming. For example, a neurodivergent person might avoid group lunches. With neurodivergent people, boundaries might be expressed non-verbally or in scripted ways. So some neurodivergent folks may avoid eye contact. They may step away or use a communication card or repeat memorized phrases like, I need space now, I need space now. These are valid ways of setting boundaries. So they may not say, I'm overwhelmed, but they might instead start stimming or just go quiet. And these are signs of needing space or support. With neurodivergent folks, touch and proximity can be activating or it can be soothing. Again, not one size fits all when it comes to this. Some people might find touch comforting. Others might find it painful or too overstimulating. And this can vary from day to day and moment to moment. As an example, a gentle hand on the shoulder might feel grounding to one person, or it might feel invasive to another. So it's always best to ask. Respecting boundaries requires asking and adapting, not assuming based on what is typical. Now we're going to move on to some harmful myths and misconceptions. So there are several harmful myths and misconceptions about neurodivergent people when it comes to topics like dating, sex, or relationships. These myths and misconceptions can increase vulnerability to sexual violence and make it much harder for neurodivergent people to disclose or be believed when harm occurs. So, of course, there's probably many myths that I don't include today, but we're just going to go over a handful. We're going to talk about why they're harmful and what is the truth. So, the first one is that neurodivergent people are childlike, asexual, or uninterested in sex and relationships. This is harmful because it leads to infantilization, overprotection, denial, and lack of autonomy. It prevents neurodivergent people from having healthy sexual exploration or expression, can erase the diversity of sexual and romantic identities among neurodiverse people, or neurodivergent people, I should say. It makes disclosures of sexual violence more likely to be ignored when we hold these beliefs and assumptions. The truth is that neurodivergent people are people with feelings and identities. Many desire connection and intimacy. Respecting their sexual agency means treating them with dignity, not denying their humanity. Next, we have neurodivergent people can't understand or give consent. This is harmful because it can lead to the removal of sexual and bodily autonomy. And then when those disclosures happen, they may be dismissed or not taken seriously. The truth is that most neurodivergent people can absolutely learn about and give informed consent when taught in ways that match their communication and processing needs. Unless someone hasn't reached the age of consent or has had their capacity legally assessed and determined otherwise, then they have the right to give sexual consent. Consent is not about perfection, it's about capacity, understanding, and respect. We have another myth or misconception about neurodiverse people being more likely to be perpetrators than survivors. This is harmful because it increases stigma and fear of neurodiverse or neurodivergent people. It distracts from real risk factors for sexual violence of neurodivergent folks. It reinforces ableist stereotypes. In truth, neurodivergent people are much more likely to be victims rather than perpetrators of sexual violence. Most are deeply empathetic and want to do the right thing, especially when supported with clear, inclusive guidance. Another myth or misconception is that neurodiverse or neurodivergent people wouldn't know if something bad happened. This is harmful because it discredits the survivor's experience or disclosure. It encourages people to ignore or dismiss those disclosures of abuse when the signs are present. In truth, neurodivergent people often know when something feels wrong, even if they describe it differently. With validation and support, they can name harm and they can take action. Many neurodivergent folks just need space to express it in their own words or ways. Another myth or misconception is that neurodivergent people are too literal to be manipulated. This is harmful because survivors may be disbelieved if they disclose such harms. In truth, Neurodivergent people can be highly trusting, yes, but this does not mean that they can't be lied to or harmed. Perpetrators often exploit social scripts and miscommunications, especially in people who take others at face value. And again, this is on the perpetrator who is exploiting that vulnerability. Neurodivergent people don't need sex education, or it's too complicated for them. This is harmful because it leads to neurodivergent people being left out of essential education and essential information. It increases the risk of them experiencing things like coercion or abuse. They may not have the words to describe such things happening to them. It reinforces dependence on their caregivers or institutions that they may rely on or depend on. In truth, neurodivergent people deserve accessible, clear, and relevant sexual health education. When taught with what they need to learn, maybe that's visual supports or social stories or role play or concrete language, it's entirely possible and it's empowering. Last one here. Well, if they have a partner, they must be doing fine. So, this is harmful because it assumes that romantic involvement equals safety or capacity. It discourages others from asking questions or offering help, even if they see those warning signs. In truth, being in a relationship doesn't mean that someone is safe. Neurodivergent people, just like anyone else or their neurotypical peers, can experience love and abuse at the same time. And believing survivors and paying attention to red flags is critical. And just to highlight, these myths do not just affect how neurodivergent people are treated by others, they also shape policies, educational materials, healthcare practices, and legal systems. That's why addressing these is essential to creating a world where neurodivergent survivors are believed, respected, and supported. So let's take a look at the show Love on the Spectrum. We have both the Australian and the US versions. These have been widely praised for increasing visibility of autistic people in romantic and sexual contexts. It's also been criticized, especially by neurodivergent viewers and advocates, for subtly or overtly reinforcing several harmful myths about neurodivergent people and dating. So let's first acknowledge what the show does right, or gets the right message, does well. It humanizes autistic adults, it breaks down stereotypes by showcasing real autistic individuals with hopes and desires and love lives, reinforcing that neurodivergent people can and want to date, form relationships, be intimate, work, and pay their taxes. Um, it depicts diverse communication styles. So it highlights different expressions, like special interests and direct communication and sensory needs, illustrating how these enrich relationships while normalizing them. It also depicts supportive environments. It features resources like the Peers Social Skills Program, and it showcases familial support systems, highlights the positive impact of accessible interventions. And it also shows representation of gender and sexuality, with autistic women sharing their stories and queer identifying participants as well. The show counters the male dominated narrative that autism has usually had in the past. But let's also acknowledge its shortcomings, its critiques, and areas for improvement, we'll call them. There is some infantilization and cute framing. Critics say that the editing, the tone, and the music sometimes portray autistic adults like childlike or adorable, encouraging a neurotypical gaze that kind of diminishes their maturity. It does tend to have a neurotypical centric lens. Um, The production's shaping they have frequent parent commentary, advice based on neurotypical norms, and coaching that aims at masking autistic behavior, which implies that neurodivergent people need to conform to the neurotypical ways. There is limited spectrum coverage. So many viewers have pointed out that the focus is on verbal and visible autistic people, often white, middle class, and with milder support needs. So it often excludes non speaking, racially diverse, trans, or more disabled, visibly disabled individuals. There's often editing for entertainment. So some fans feel that the show leans into awkward moments for viewer amusement, using cliffhangers and emphasizing social missteps in ways that border exploitation of the cast. And lastly, there's limited depiction of inter-neurotype relationships. So most couples who are shown are often autistic and autistic, reinforcing a false boundary between neurodivergent and neurotypical relationships. Glimpses of mixed neurotype datings are very rare. Okay. So, moving on, we know from many studies and anecdotal reports that neurodivergent people face higher risks of sexual violence, but systemic and structural barriers make it hard to collect larger scale, accurate, and inclusive data. One difficulty in finding comprehensive statistics on sexual violence in neurodivergent populations is that most existing research focuses on single diagnosis, such as autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, rather than using a broader umbrella of neurodivergence. Researchers often use this approach because studying one group makes it easier to draw clear conclusions, but at the cost of inclusivity. Additionally, research often follows medical models that require specific diagnostic criteria to include participants, especially in academic or clinical settings. So we're left with fragmented data that doesn't capture the full scope of neurodivergent experiences, especially for people with multiple diagnoses or less recognized diagnosis, or who are underdiagnosed, or who identify as neurodivergent but without a formal label or a formal diagnosis. More trauma informed, accessible, and neurodiversity affirming research methods are urgently needed. That said, let's look at the studies that are out there indicating that heightened level of risk. In 2023, a US study by Libster, Kasari, and Sturm found that college students with ADHD were 2 times more likely to experience unwanted sexual contact. So they compared that with the students without ADHD. A nationwide Danish cohort study published in the International Journal of Population Data Science found that children with autism or intellectual disabilities are about 3.8 times more likely to be victims of reported sexual crimes compared to their neurotypical peers. The study by Brown, Pena, and Rankin in 2017 used data from US undergraduates and examined experiences over the past 5 years. They found that in college populations, students with autism had significantly higher rates of unwanted sexual contact compared to their neurotypical peers. And published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience in 2022, a study conducted in France found that up to 90% of women with autism have experienced sexual violence, nearly 3 times the rate compared to neurotypical women. Most had multiple incidents, often beginning before the age of 18, and a majority did not receive help after reporting. In a 2012 World Health Organization report, it found globally people with intellectual disabilities found a 4.6 times greater risk of sexual violence compared to non-disabled individuals. Shortly, you'll begin seeing quotes from neurodivergent survivors throughout this webinar. They're included intentionally to ground our learning in real voices and to remind us that no statistic is more important than the lived experiences behind them. So, there are several unique vulnerabilities of neurodivergent individuals that we will discuss today regarding sexual violence victimization. I want to stress this before we move on that neurodivergent people are not vulnerable because of their neurotype, but because the systems around them often fail to teach them, listen, adapt, or respond in the ways that they need. When we understand these unique risks and vulnerabilities, we can respond with respect and hopefully with change. So, the first unique vulnerability is inaccessible or non inclusive sexual health education. Many neurodivergent people receive little to no education about dating, relationships, sex, or consent that is meaningful or relevant to how they learn and process information. Most sexual health and consent education is designed for neurotypical learners. It relies heavily on abstract concepts, fast paced lessons, or indirect language like idioms and sarcasm or euphemisms. Neurodivergent learners may benefit from more concrete, literal, visual, or step by step approaches, which are rarely provided. This leaves many neurodivergent folks feeling unprepared to recognize healthy versus harmful dynamics, especially when social cues and expectations are unclear and overwhelming. Our first neurodivergent voice here, quote, "Nobody ever explained consent to me. In school, they just said, don't pressure someone. But what if you don't realize you're being pressured? I didn't even know I could say no." And this quote is from a late diagnosed autistic survivor. The next unique vulnerability of neurodivergent individuals is that infantilization and asexual stereotypes that we kind of talked about earlier in our myths and misconceptions. Neurodivergent people, especially those who require any extra support, are often treated as childlike or incapable of adult decisions, even well into adulthood. This can result in being excluded from sexual education or safety planning altogether, having their autonomy ignored by caregivers or service providers, being overprotected in some areas but underprotected when real risks arise. These narratives create blind spots in support systems and they silence survivors. People always described me as cute, implying I was an adorable child, which is far from a sexual being. And this is from a neurodivergent Reddit user. Neurodivergent individuals may rely on caregivers, support persons, or institutional environments like group homes, respite care, or educational aids. So they may have that dependency on those systems of support, which creates complex power dynamics where saying no may not feel like it's an option. For example, a person might not feel safe disclosing harm from a caregiver if they also rely on that caregiver for housing, meals, or communication access. If I said no, they threatened to stop helping me. I felt like I had no choice but to comply, even though it hurt me deeply. And this is from a neurodivergent person describing coercion by their support staff. Many neurodivergent folks become skilled at masking their distress, discomfort, or sensory overload to avoid standing out or getting into trouble. This survival strategy can lead to ignoring their own gut feelings, enduring unsafe situations, or feeling unable to advocate for themselves in those moments of harm. When someone has been told to ignore their discomfort in order to please others their whole life, it can feel like that naturally extends to their romantic or sexual relationships and encounters as well. Because they've been conditioned to override their own needs, neurodivergent survivors may not recognize abuse until much later, or they may downplay the harm that they experienced. One thing that I think plays a big part is masking. My whole life, I've been taught that I shouldn't make such a big deal of things. I was trained. Any reaction I have would be too much. And this quote is from a Reddit user with autism. Some neurodivergent people may have trouble identifying subtler forms of coercion or grooming. They may misinterpret or be confused by social cues. They may struggle to find the words to explain what happened. Or in cases where they did not receive any education on these topics, like they may not have the words to describe what they really went through. They may not have the words like abuse, coercion, if they were never taught that. Legal, medical, and educational systems may also expect neurodivergent survivors to explain what happened to them in a neurotypical way, which could result in their being dismissed, seen as lying or manipulative or not credible, maybe due to their flat affect or their use of scripting or echolalia or atypical body language. I didn't know I was being raped because my autistic brain thinks literally. And abuse is often more subtle. It turns out rapists don't always say, "I'm going to rape you." This one, we actually have a first name, Fatima, via Disabled Survivors Unite. It was a written testimony for that study. Neurodivergent folks are also under-recognized as survivors, despite having experienced higher rates of violence, including sexual, physical, and emotional abuse compared to their neurotypical peers. They're often, I should say, they are rarely recognized or centered in conversations about sexual violence, prevention, or survivor care. And that's, again, why during this webinar, we are really trying to center on those voices. There were quite a few times where I was forced to have sex when I absolutely couldn't handle it. But it was easier to get it over with than have to listen to my spouse guilt me. I truly didn't realize that this behavior was sexual abuse. And this quote is from an autistic survivor reflecting on a coercive relationship. Some neurodivergent folks, such as men, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ plus folks, may face additional barriers and compounding discrimination and stigma because of things like sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism all combined. They're more likely to be dismissed or even criminalized. They're less likely to be believed, supported, or protected when they experience sexual violence. I was raped as a teenager by a woman, but no one calls it rape. I'm a statistic anomaly. And this is from an autistic male survivor on Reddit. So we're going to move on to recognizing and responding to neurodivergent survivors. Similar to their neurotypical peers, any significant change in a person's baseline coping and behavior is worth exploring, as well as any regression can be a key indicator that a check-in is needed. However, because neurodivergent people may express distress differently than neurotypical people, and because some may not disclose trauma directly, it's vital for support persons to recognize any nonverbal, behavioral, emotional, and sensory signs that something may be wrong. Now, these changes don't automatically mean someone has experienced sexual violence, but they may be a cue to gently check in with care and curiosity. So, we're looking for things like sudden or increased masking. They may appear more socially appropriate or withdrawn. They may be working harder to suppress their stimming or emotional expression. This masking may come from fear, shame, or trying to avoid detection by their abuser. We're monitoring for changes in communication. Maybe there's increased scripting, echolalia, or use of alternative communication. Perhaps they're less verbal than usual or have delayed responses when speaking. Maybe they're saying things like, I did something wrong or I made a mistake without providing any other details. We are watching out for shutdowns or meltdowns if they're more frequent or intense, especially if they're being triggered by minor stressors or sensory input, which seems unusual for them, or maybe we're seeing overwhelm that seems hard to explain or is out of the ordinary for them. We could see fear responses or hypervigilance. Maybe they're startling easily, flinching at touch or at loud noises. Maybe we're seeing that they're avoiding certain people, places, or situations without an explanation, or they're appearing just tense, anxious, or scanning their environment frequently. We could see some sensory or physical distress. Maybe they're having heightened sensitivity to touch or sound or light. Maybe they have unexplained stomach aches, headaches, fatigue. Perhaps they're suddenly avoiding showers, clothing, or medical appointments. We might see changes in relationships. Maybe they're withdrawing from trusted people or becoming unusually clingy. Maybe they are expressing confusion or distress about boundaries, affection, and consent. Maybe they're developing fears of abandonment or difficulty trusting others. Keeping an eye out on emotional and behavioral shifts, perhaps we see sudden risk taking, increased anger and aggression, or compulsive behavior. We might see expressions of guilt, shame, or low self worth. And we also need to keep an eye out for suicidal ideation and self harm. Neurodivergent individuals who experience sexual violence face significantly elevated risks of self harm and suicide. This is both due to trauma and existing vulnerabilities. So, we're going to keep an eye out for an increase in those self harming behaviors, such as cutting or whatever else it is that they're doing. They may be developing deep or intense interests in death or things surrounding death. We may witness that they have worsening depression or anxiety. Maybe they're talking about wanting to die, or they're showing repetitive or ruminating negative thoughts related to suicide. Maybe they're even sharing a plan for suicide or giving away their belongings. Maybe it's statements of hopelessness or having no purpose or no reason to go on, things like that, that might trigger us that a check in is definitely needed. So let's say we do recognize some of those changes and we do want to check in with that person. We need to be prepared to hear a disclosure. So let's first talk about what to avoid. So we do not want to rush, we don't want to interrupt, and we don't want to fill in the blanks. Remember that neurodivergent people may need more time to process information or to form a response. If we're interrupting or trying to finish their sentences for them, we may shut down the disclosure or create a sense of pressure. Remember, silence doesn't mean disengagement. It may mean they're still thinking, still processing. We do not want to interpret flat affect or stimming or lateralness as deception. Many neurodivergent people communicate differently, and that lack of eye contact or that monotone voice or the repetitive movements are not signs of lying. In fact, these might be signs of distress or their attempts at self-regulation. So, what to do instead? We want to check in gently using open and non-threatening prompts like, has something been bothering you? Is there something you need to talk about? Keep your tone calm and steady. We can also ask for communication and sensory preferences. Would you prefer to talk, write, or type? Is there anything in this space that's uncomfortable for you? And we want to respect their preferences about lighting, volume, touch, and environment. You want to use plain, direct, respectful language, avoiding the use of metaphors or idioms. So instead of saying, let's get to the bottom of this, say, I want to understand what's happened. Clear language shows respect and it reduces the cognitive load on that person. It's important to offer choices and to ask before touching. Consent includes how we engage in conversation or offer comfort. Always ask before offering a hug, moving closer, resting a hand on their shoulder, moving someone's chair, or leading them to a different room. Offering choices builds safety. So this could sound like, would you rather stay in here or would you rather take a break? And allow extra time for processing. Pause, give space. If someone goes quiet, don't immediately move on or interpret it as refusal. Say, take your time. I'm here when you're ready. You want to validate their experiences, even if they're not expressed in expected ways. Neurodivergent survivors may use scripting, repetitive or non-traditional language to describe what happened. They may say things that seem disconnected or out of order. That doesn't make their story any less valid. Just say, thank you for telling me, or what you're feeling makes sense. And lastly, we want to be open to nonverbal disclosures. Not all disclosures are verbal. Someone may draw what happened, shut down completely, script a scene from a show, or use gestures. If a person writes bad touch and that's all they write, that is communication and it deserves a sensitive response. When in doubt, slow down, stay curious, and center on consent. And remember that every brain processes differently, and our job is to respond with care and not assumptions. We're going to move on to victim blaming right now. So it's unfortunately all too common for survivors of sexual violence to hear victim blaming. This is where a victim is blamed fully or even partially for what happened to them. Remember that any blame being placed on a survivor is blame that is removed from the person who chose to commit that violence. Neurodivergent survivors often face unique and amplified forms of victim blaming that go beyond what many neurotypical survivors experience. These forms of blame are shaped by ableism, misunderstandings of communication and behavior differences, and systemic disbelief. Here are a few key ways that neurodivergent folks experience victim blaming differently or more intensely. You should have known what they meant. They're blamed for missing social cues. Because some neurodivergent folks struggle with social cues, scripts, or boundaries, they may enter situations without understanding implied risks. This is often twisted into blame. Neurodivergent survivors are often blamed for not recognizing signs of danger, manipulation, or sexual intent. For example, some neurotypical folks usually understand the sexual undertone and context of Netflix and chill, whereas a neurodivergent person may agree to Netflix and chill, thinking it was really about watching Netflix and chilling. We must remember that responsibility always lies with the person who chose to violate consent. I wish people would explain sexual innuendos and not shame me for not knowing. No one is comfortable to talk about sex in exact words, yet they are comfortable at hinting at it in everything from movies to games, text to music. If you don't understand what no one is willing to teach, then that's on you. And I wish that was not the case. From an autistic survivor of sexual violence. You're not acting like a victim. Neurodivergent survivors may have their responses misread as lying or inconsistent. If they freeze, or if they do not cry, or if they script their disclosure, maybe they show flat affect, they may be seen as unemotional, deceptive, or exaggerating. They might not fit the perfect victim mold that society often has. I am crushed today when I learned the reason for the police to quit the investigation on my case was because they find me confusing. They said I was back and forth and that they didn't know what actually happened. The investigation lasted about 7 months and I tried my best to cooperate, so I was shocked to hear that they were confused. They say the police are trained to handle people like me, but I'm still being misunderstood. And this is from a neurodivergent Reddit user on why their sexual assault investigation was dropped. Why didn't you stop it? Neurodivergent folks may be blamed for not saying no or not fighting back. Many neurodivergent folks experience shutdowns or freezes or have delayed processing or don't understand what's happened until it's over when they experience sexual violence. The freeze response is common, especially among autistic and ADHD survivors. I was wordless, motionless, and afraid. I didn't know how to get home. I hadn't said no. I hadn't been able to. More importantly, I hadn't said yes. I hadn't been asked. And this quote is from a non speaking neurodivergent survivor. Are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding? Many neurodivergent folks are assumed to have misunderstood the situation. Supporters or support persons, professionals, or institutions may infantilize neurodivergent survivors or assume that their account is inaccurate due to their different processing style. Neurodivergent people can and do accurately report harm, even if they communicate it differently. I saw the psych a few times and stopped because she thought that she should not treat me any different than a non autistic person and said, I understand you were victimized, but you might not have been assaulted if you could have read social cues. I didn't like having my autism or even my identity invalidated by someone who was supposed to help me sort through what had happened to me and the feelings that it had created. She did diagnose me with PTSD, though, and that made me feel less crazy. I stopped going to her soon after, though, as I didn't feel like being victim shamed again. And this quote is from an autistic survivor of sexual violence. You seemed fine. Neurodivergent survivors are often punished for either masking or not masking. If they mask, they might hear, you seemed fine. If they didn't mask, they might hear, you're acting unstable. Neurodivergent survivors may either be disbelieved because they appeared too composed, or they may be dismissed as too emotional or too much. Neurodivergent survivors may mask distress to survive. Others may stim, shut down, or dysregulate due to sensory and emotional overload. Why were you alone with them? Why did you let them in? Neurodivergent survivors may be blamed for being too trusting or too naive. They're often seen as responsible for not detecting manipulation or coercion. But we know that predators or perpetrators of harm often exploit trust, and that trust is not consent and should never be weaponized against a survivor. Victim blaming is always harmful. For neurodivergent survivors, it often intersects with ableism and turning their brain differences into excuses for why they are at fault, aren't believed, or supported. Support professionals must be especially mindful to not repeat victim blaming statements or sentiments. Moving on to self blame, shame, and self hatred in neurodivergent survivors. Let's explore why many neurodivergent survivors of sexual violence may experience these feelings. First, it's common for neurodivergent survivors to feel like they should have known better or missed warning signs, especially if they had difficulty in recognizing social cues or boundaries previously. Many have histories of being gaslit or dismissed, where others questioned their experiences or minimized their feelings, and this can deeply affect how they see themselves and their trauma. Some survivors may blame their neurodivergence itself, thinking, if I wasn't like this, maybe it wouldn't have happened. There's often fear that disclosing abuse will cause more trouble, they won't be believed, or it might lead to negative consequences. And this fear can silence survivors for a very long time. My whole life, I followed the direction of others because I did not know the social rules. And when I did what I wanted and what I was comfortable with, I was shamed for it and told to stop. So I went along. No one ever explained to me the social cues of sex, and they all just assumed I should know. When I asked, people thought it was adorable that I did not know. I remember the pain, and when my perpetrator said, just go with it, everything turned numb. I remember hating myself for not stopping it, questioning if I asked for it because I did not know the social code that had surrounded me for my whole life. And this quote is from an autistic survivor of sexual violence. As supporters or support persons, we play a critical role in helping survivors navigate these feelings. We can remind them often that this was not your fault. This simple statement can be incredibly healing and affirming. We can gently correct their harmful self talk by saying things like, you didn't mess up, somebody crossed your boundary. And this helps reframe their experience in a healthier way. We can encourage survivors to name the harm and recognize their reactions as valid and understandable, as responses to trauma. We can affirm their neurodivergence by saying things like, there's nothing wrong with how your brain works. The responsibility lies with the person who chose to cause harm. This helps separate identity from blame and promotes self-acceptance. Ultimately, our goal is to create a safe space where survivors feel heard, validated, and supported without judgment. I thought I just misunderstood what happened. I didn't want to make it awkward. From a survivor with ADHD after a non-consensual experience. Healing is deeply individual, especially for neurodivergent survivors who have often been forced to mask, override their boundaries, or navigate services that were not built for them. healing may look different than what professionals are used to seeing, and that difference must be respected and supported. It could look like creating predictability and control through routines, sensory tools, visual supports to help reestablish safety in their body and in their environment. It could look like processing trauma in non traditional ways. So, some neurodivergent folks may process through scripting or drawing or gaming or movement or stimming, not necessarily through traditional talk therapy. Being allowed to feel without being pathologized. So, having a meltdown or a shutdown or an emotional outburst and recognizing it as it's not a failure to regulate, but that it was actually a legitimate trauma response that can be healing, as well as feeling safe to let down the mask, to not mask, to stop masking. For many, healing involves that unmasking and allowing themselves to express themselves authentically without fear of punishment or judgment. It could also look like having autonomy in the healing process, which means allowing them to choose how, when, and with whom they heal. It's critical. So, this can also include how they choose to communicate, how they set boundaries, and what kinds of support they want to use. So, moving on to rebuilding systems for neurodivergent healing. We need to recognize that many support systems, including healthcare, education, justice, and crisis response, they often operate in ways that exclude, misinterpret, or re traumatize neurodivergent survivors. And true change requires reimagining how these systems define and respond to violence. Policy and system shifts could include things like training staff on neurodivergence and trauma beyond basic awareness. Training should include how to recognize different communication styles, support stimming, respect processing time, and responding without judgment. Rewriting forms and procedures and education to use plain language, visual supports, or multiple modes of input, not just spoken or written. It could look like embedding sensory awareness in these systems. Maybe it looks like having quiet spaces or control over lighting and sound. Maybe it looks like having options for virtual or asynchronous support within those systems. And it looks like hiring and listening to neurodivergent survivors in decision making roles, not just as tokens or advisors, but as leaders shaping services. For years, I hid my abuse because I thought no one would believe me. When I finally found people who saw me, not just my diagnosis, that's when healing began. This is from an ADHD survivor shared in a survivor support podcast. Before we finish today, I just wanted to recommend a few resources. So, first, we have Aid Canada, which offers a wide range of accessible, evidence informed resources for neurodivergent and autistic people, as well as their families, caregivers, and support networks. And this is just a snapshot of a few of those resources. There are pages upon pages upon pages, and not just to do with sexuality and sexual assault and PTSD. I just chose this snapshot as it related to this webinar. So go ahead and check out that resource, that website. And here I am showing a few promising resources from OR, Organization for Autism Research, that could be used by support persons as well as recommended for youth and for families. So they have a downloadable curriculum, which this would be for teachers, on safer dating for youth on the autism spectrum. It was written by researchers at Boston Medical Center, And this curriculum is for educating autistic young individuals about how to build and maintain healthy relationships in college. The curriculum is divided up into 6 sessions with activities and homework ideas designed to help engage autistic students in these topics. Or also has this resource called Search and Snicker, Conversations about Relationships and Sexuality, which offers important tools needed to provide healthy guidance about intimate relationships to autistic adults and other neurodivergent individuals. It was informed by the neurodivergent community and best practices. The guides are available as PDF downloads, and they are targeted at 3 distinct groups, being family members, direct service providers, and healthcare professionals. Additionally, they have a guide called Sex Ed for Self Advocates, and this guide is a sexuality and sex education resource written specifically for autistic people aged 15 and up. Autistic people sometimes don't have the chance to learn about sexuality and sex in ways that work for them, so OR created this guide as a starting point to change that. In each of the 9 sections of the guide, self advocates will be able to read articles and watch brief videos before testing their knowledge about a given topic and practicing new skills. There are also additional resources for parents on the same page as the guide. So check that out. Okay, and with that, I thank you for spending this time with me today. We've explored how neurodivergent people experience the world differently. We talked about their unique vulnerabilities and barriers that neurodivergent people face regarding sexual violence. We've also seen how these systems often operate in ways that exclude, misinterpret, or re traumatize neurodivergent survivors. We also finished up with some very promising resources that seek to educate neurodivergent youth and folks in ways that they can understand. It is easy to feel overwhelmed when we realize how much needs to change, but every single one of us can be a part of that change. When we slow down, listen, and respond with intention, we create conditions where neurodivergent survivors don't have to fight to be understood. Let this not be the end of the conversation, but the beginning of real changes in your schools, clinics, organizations, and communities. This work is not about perfection, it's about presence. And it's about the belief that healing and dignity belong to everyone. Together, let's build a world where neurodivergent survivors are seen, believed, and supported. Thank you.